The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window as I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I leaned against the counter, savoring the first sip, and casually glanced outside. Then, my heart stopped. My driveway was empty. I blinked. Maybe I was just groggy from sleep. I knew I had parked my car there last night. I set down my coffee and stepped closer to the window, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, my car was gone. My stomach twisted into a knot as I rushed outside. Maybe it had been stolen? But how? This was a quiet, gated community. Car theft wasn't exactly common here. My pulse pounded as I scanned the street. Nothing. Not even shattered glass to indicate a break-in. That's when I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, watering her plants across the street. She had lived here for 30 years, long before the HOA took over. If anyone saw something, it was her. "Mrs. Patel," I called, jogging over to her. "Did you see anything?" "My car. It's gone." She pursed her lips and let out a deep sigh, setting down her watering can. "James, the HOA had it towed this morning, about an hour ago." My stomach dropped. The HOA. My freaking homeowners association towed my car? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Why would they tow it? I was parked in my own driveway. Mrs. Patel shook her head. "I don't know, but I saw the truck pull up. 2 men got out, hooked up your car, and within minutes, it was gone. I was going to call you, but I thought they must have let you know. They didn't. No email, no call, nothing." I clenched my jaw, pulled out my phone, and dialed the HOA office. It rang twice before the queen of all things infuriating, Diane, answered. "Ah, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "What a surprise. What can I do for you today?" I cut right to the point. "Where is my car?" Diane let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "Oh dear, did you not see the notice? Your vehicle was towed due to a violation of Rule 17B, Section 4. No cars may be parked in open areas past 2 a.m. My fingers tightened around my phone. "What are you talking about? I was parked in my own driveway." "Yes," she said, completely unfazed. "And unfortunately, your driveway extends exactly 3 feet onto community property. We had Richard measure it last night." Richard. One of Diane's loyal minions. The man who spent his entire retirement measuring things with a tape measure, looking for rule violations. This was personal. I gritted my teeth. "You can't just tow my car without notice." "We did send a notice," she replied, her voice oozing condescension. "Maybe you should check your email, or perhaps your spam folder." I pulled up my inbox, already knowing what I would find. Nothing. "Diane, there's no email, no notice. You never sent one." A brief pause, then an amused chuckle. "Well, that's unfortunate, but the rule is the rule." I clenched my jaw. "How do I get my car back?" She perked up, clearly delighted to inform me of the next part. "Oh, that's simple. Just contact our approved towing company and pay the retrieval fee, $500, plus $75 per day for storage." My vision blurred with rage. $500? This was a scam. A blatant money grab. "You can't be serious," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm always serious about our community's standards," she replied sweetly. "Let me know if you need the number for the towing company." She hung up. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, breathing hard. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't about rules. This was Diane and her HOA flexing their power. But they had no idea what they had just done. Because as I stood there, seething, something clicked in my mind. Something big. I pulled up an old email from my property management company. Scrolling past the rent collection summaries, I froze when I saw a name I hadn't paid attention to before. Pinecrest Gardens Homeowners Association. I clicked on it. It was the HOA's lease payment receipt, because the HOA rented their office space. And the landlord they had been paying for the past 8 years? Me. I started laughing. Hard. They had no clue that the man they just tried to screw over owned the very building where they held their board meetings. The HOA had just picked a fight with their own landlord, and I was about to show them exactly why that was the worst mistake they had ever made. I stood in my kitchen, still gripping my phone, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and amusement. They were paying rent to me, the same people who just towed my car. They had no idea. I leaned against the counter, taking a slow breath. I needed to think. I had power here. Real, legal power. But if I wanted to take them down properly, I needed to be strategic. First, I had to get my car back. I pulled up the number for the towing company and dialed. A gruff voice answered. Speedy Recovery Towing, what do you need? I didn't waste time. I need to recover my vehicle, a silver Honda Accord. It was towed this morning by order of the Pinecrest Gardens HOA. Yeah, the guy muttered, shuffling some papers. Got it here. You're looking at $500 for the tow, plus $75 for today's storage. Goes up at midnight. That's robbery, I said flatly. Not my rules, buddy, he replied. You paying? Or are we keeping it overnight? I clenched my jaw. Not yet. I needed a way to get it back without letting the HOA win. Then it hit me. I scrolled through my contacts and found a number I hadn't used in years. My lawyer, Samantha Monroe. I pressed call. James? She answered after 2 rings. Haven't heard from you in ages. What's up? I grinned despite my frustration. I need your legal expertise. My HOA just towed my car from my driveway and is trying to charge me $500 to get it back. But here's the kicker. I paused for dramatic effect. I own the building where they rent their office. Silence. Then, Samantha burst out laughing. Oh, James, she said between chuckles. This is going to be fun. Tell me everything. I filled her in on every last detail. Diane's smug attitude, the mysterious measurement of my driveway, the lack of notification, and the outrageous fees. When I finished, Samantha was all business. First things first, she said. Pull up your HOA agreement. Look at their towing policy and any mention of how fines and penalties are supposed to be issued. I grabbed my laptop and accessed the digital copy of the HOA agreement, the one I had actually read, unlike most homeowners. I skimmed through it, and there it was. Section 4.7. All towing actions must be preceded by a written warning at least 48 hours before enforcement. I clenched my fist. They broke their own rules, I said. Exactly, Samantha replied. That means you have leverage. Legally, they violated their own contract with you. We can get your car back without paying them a dime. I grinned. What do I do? Send them a formal demand letter, she instructed. I'll draft it. It'll say that unless they return your vehicle immediately, we'll file a civil suit for unlawful towing, breach of contract, and damages. Oh, and since you're their landlord, you can also start asking some very inconvenient financial questions. I nodded, feeling the first real spark of excitement. Good. Send it over as soon as possible. Will do, she said. In the meantime, start making noise. Let the other homeowners know what's happening. If they did this to you, they've done it to others. She was right. I needed allies. I hung up and stepped outside. Mrs. Patel was still in her front yard watching me with an expectant look. Mrs. Patel, I called, walking over. How long has Diane been running things? She sighed. Far too long. The board used to be fair, but once she took over, everything changed. The fines, the inspections, the constant harassment. It's gotten worse every year. I nodded, my suspicions confirmed. How many people do you think she's targeted? Mrs. Patel's face darkened. Almost everyone, at some point. The Johnsons had their mailbox removed because it wasn't the approved color. Miguel got fined $200 for having a hammock in his backyard. And don't get me started on Ellen. She was forced to change her front door color twice. I shook my head. And no one fights back? They're afraid, she admitted. Diane knows exactly how to make people miserable, and most folks don't have the time or money to challenge her, so they just pay up. I exhaled slowly, feeling my frustration build. Well, I said, that's about to change. Mrs. Patel's eyes gleamed. What are you planning? I smiled. Something big. But first, I needed proof. I went back inside, grabbed my laptop, and opened my landlord account for the HOA office building. I wanted to see exactly how much they were paying in rent. I scrolled through their payment history. And then I saw something that made my breath catch. The HOA had doubled their rental payments in the last 6 months. Why? I dug deeper, pulling up old financial records. According to the agreement, the rent should have remained fixed until next year. But suddenly, payments had increased from $2,000 to $4,000 per month. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and called Samantha again. Found something interesting, I said. The HOA has been paying double rent for the past 6 months, but there's no record of why. Samantha let out a low whistle. That smells like embezzlement. Someone on the board is skimming money. I grinned. Which means I don't just have leverage, I have them by the throat. Samantha laughed. Oh, this just keeps getting better. File that under Exhibit A. And James? Yeah? Don't pay the towing fee. We're going to make them regret ever messing with you. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, grinning. Diane thought she was untouchable. She thought she could harass me, tow my car, and get away with it. But she had no idea what was coming next. Because by the time I was done, the entire HOA board would be exposed. And Diane? She'd be begging to disappear. I sat at my desk, staring at the financial records I had just uncovered. The HOA was paying double rent, and nobody seemed to know why. If this was what it looked like, embezzlement, then Diane and her little band of rule enforcers had more than just a power trip going on. They had a full-scale fraud operation. I needed to hit them where it hurt. I fired off an email to Samantha with all the documents attached. Subject: Evidence of financial misconduct. Pinecrest Gardens, HOA Samantha. Attaching financial records from the last 6 months. HOA rent payments doubled without explanation. This could be illegal misallocation of funds. Let's strategize how to use this. She responded almost instantly. James, this is major. If they've been collecting increased fees from homeowners to cover this, it's fraud. I'll start drafting a formal complaint to the county. In the meantime, push them, make them sweat. I grinned. I knew exactly how to do that. The HOA office. Visit. The next morning, I put on my best business casual outfit, a crisp button-down, blazer, and slacks. I wanted to look like the kind of guy who meant business. Because today, I wasn't showing up as a homeowner. I was showing up as their landlord. The HOA office was a small, beige building in a strip mall, wedged between a dry cleaner and a failing smoothie shop, the kind of place that reeked of misplaced authority. I pushed open the door, and the receptionist, an older woman with tightly curled hair and a scowl, looked up from her desk. Can I help you? She asked, already irritated. Yes, I said, placing my hands on the counter. I'm here to speak with Diane Mercer. She squinted at me. Do you have an appointment? No, I said. But she'll want to make time for me. The receptionist sighed and picked up the phone. Diane, there's a... She paused, glancing at me. A gentleman here to see you. I smiled. She has no idea. After a moment, the door to the back office swung open, and Diane appeared, her expression instantly souring when she saw me. You, she spat. I don't have time for whatever nonsense complaint you... I held up a thick manila folder. This isn't about my car, Diane, I said smoothly. It's about your rent payments. Her face went pale. Excuse me, she said, her voice suddenly much quieter. I stepped past the receptionist and into her office, closing the door behind me. She looked like she wanted to call security, but she didn't, because she knew. I placed the folder on her desk, tapping it lightly. Care to explain why the HOA's rent doubled in the past 6 months? Diane swallowed. That's none of your business, I laughed. Oh, but it is, Diane, because I own this building, which means I'm the one receiving those payments, and I have no record of any changes to your lease agreement. Her eyes darted to the folder, then back to me. I don't handle the finances, she stammered. Then who does? She hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly on the desk. The treasurer. And where can I find them? She glared at me. You know I don't have to answer you. I leaned forward slightly. You really want to play it that way? She clenched her jaw. I pulled a printed copy of the HOA bylaws from my pocket and laid it on the desk beside the folder. You and I both know that under Section 9.4, homeowners have a right to financial transparency from their HOA. If funds are being mismanaged, the board is legally responsible. Now, I'm giving you a chance to explain before I take this directly to the county financial auditor. Diane's eyes flashed with panic. You wouldn't, she whispered. I smirked. Oh, Diane, I said, standing up. I absolutely would. I turned and walked toward the door, letting the silence stretch between us. My hand was on the knob when she finally cracked. Wait. I paused. She let out a slow breath. Richard handles the payments. He's been adjusting things. I turned back. Adjusting them how? Her fingers fidgeted with a paperclip. He told us we needed extra funds for upcoming projects. Said he was securing private loans on behalf of the HOA. But when I asked for records, he brushed me off. I narrowed my eyes. So Richard has been playing banker? Without board approval? Diane nodded slowly. I smiled. You just made my day, Diane. She looked up at me, suddenly desperate. Look, I didn't know about any of this. If Richard is doing something shady, I don't want any part of it. Then prove it, I said. She hesitated. I leaned down, my voice lower. Help me expose him. For the first time, Diane looked truly nervous. She knew the power Richard held. But she also knew that if I was right, he would take her down with him. Fine, she muttered. But you didn't hear it from me. I grinned. Of course not. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out the door, I glanced back. Oh, and Diane? She looked up. I'll be expecting those containers to be gone by the end of the week. Her face twisted in anger, but she didn't argue. The plan comes together. As soon as I got home, I called Samantha. Well, she asked. Richard is behind it, I said. He's been moving HOA money around without authorization. Diane's already cracking. Samantha let out a satisfied hum. Perfect. That means she'll fold when we hit her with legal pressure. I sat down, feeling the adrenaline. What's next? Next, she said. We put together a formal demand for all financial records from the past year. And while we do that, she paused. We let the rest of the neighborhood know exactly what's going on. I grinned. It was time to turn the homeowners against their own HOA. The game was officially on. The next morning, I woke up to an HOA violation notice taped to my front door. Notice of infraction failure to maintain proper driveway cleanliness. Unapproved structural modifications to property. Unauthorized distribution of misleading information. Fine amount, $750. I laughed. They were getting desperate. Richard must have caught wind that I was poking around, and this was his way of hitting back. But what he didn't realize was that this only made things worse for him. I snapped a picture of the notice and sent it to Samantha. Me. They're panicking. New fines for misleading information. Samantha. They just gave us evidence of retaliation. Keep collecting. I grabbed my coffee, sat down at my laptop, and got to work. It was time to inform the neighborhood about what was really going on. A neighborhood meeting they wouldn't forget. By mid-afternoon, I had posted flyers around the neighborhood. No HOA fines could stop me from spreading the truth. Attention homeowners concerned about your HOA fees? Join us tonight at 7 p.m. at the community center for a discussion on how Pinecrest Gardens HOA is handling your money. Why have HOA fees gone up? Where is the extra money going? Who is really making decisions for this neighborhood? Come learn the truth. Your HOA doesn't want you to know. I printed over 50 copies and stuck them on mailboxes, bulletin boards, and streetlights. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to know they had lost control. By 6:30 p.m., the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People were talking, curious, suspicious. A few neighbors even came to my house to ask questions. James, what's this all about? Mr. Patel asked, his arms crossed. Transparency, I said, handing him a printed summary of what I had found. I think our board has been mismanaging our fees. I have proof that they've been increasing rent payments for their office space without telling us why. His eyes widened. And you're saying you own the building? I nodded. They're using our money to cover their tracks. Mrs. Jenkins, an older woman who had lived here for decades, sighed. I knew something wasn't right when they raised our fees twice in 1 year, but they always brush us off at meetings. Not this time, I said. Tonight, they're going to answer to all of us. The showdown at the community center. By 7 p.m., the room was packed. More people than I had expected. At least 30 homeowners, all seated, murmuring among themselves. The tension was thick. At the front of the room, Richard sat with his arms crossed, scowling. Karen flipped through some papers, pretending to be busy. And Diane? She was visibly nervous. She had been avoiding eye contact with me ever since our meeting. I walked to the front of the room and cleared my throat. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to start by asking a simple question. How many of you have had an issue with this HOA? Slowly, hands started going up. First Mrs. Jenkins, then the Patels, then Miguel from down the street, then another, and another. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I continued. Over the past 6 months, our fees have increased, our rules have gotten stricter, and fines have been handed out like candy. But where is all that money going? I held up the financial records. I requested the HOA's financial statements. Guess what I found? I paused for effect. Rent payments for the HOA office have doubled, but there's no explanation why. The crowd started murmuring. Diane stared at the table, silent. Richard stood up abruptly. This is an attempt to slander the HOA. We've been nothing but transparent. These claims are completely unfounded. Oh, really? I said, holding up a folder. Then explain this. I passed the folder to the front row, letting it circulate. Homeowners flipped through the documents, their eyes widening. This isn't right, Mr. Patel said. We were never told about these changes. Richard turned red. These records are taken out of context. Really? I interrupted. Because I also happen to know that you were the one handling these payments, without board approval. Gasps echoed through the room. Diane looked down at her lap. Karen adjusted her glasses nervously. Richard glared at me. You're making a mistake. No, I said, stepping forward. The mistake was thinking nobody would notice. The room broke into a heated debate. Where's the rest of our money going? Someone shouted. What about all the extra fines? Another neighbor asked. Why have we been paying for new office furniture? Richard looked around, realizing he was losing. That's when Diane finally cracked. She stood up, her voice shaking. I didn't know he was doing this, she said quickly. Richard told us everything was legal. He controlled all the payments. He even told us not to ask questions. Richard spun to her. You traitor! You lied to us, she shot back, stepping away from him. You said you'd handle everything, that we didn't need to worry, and now we're going to get investigated. Silence. Investigated. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. I smiled. That's right. My lawyer has already started preparing an official complaint to the county. There will be an audit. And when they see what's been happening here, well, I shrugged. Let's just say the HOA might be looking for new leadership. Richard's face turned white. This meeting is over, he shouted, grabbing his papers. None of you have the authority to challenge us. Actually, Mr. Patel said, pulling out a printed document, according to HOA bylaws, if 75% of homeowners vote to remove board members, they have no choice but to step down. Richard froze. You can't do that, he stammered. We just did, Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. And just like that, the tide completely shifted. The community was turning against them. I could see Richard calculating his next move. But it didn't matter, because this fight was already over. Richard stormed out of the meeting, his face twisted with fury. His supporters, what little remained of them, followed closely behind, whispering among themselves. Karen and Diane stayed frozen in their seats, pale and shaken. The rest of the room buzzed with energy, outrage, and determination. I turned back to the homeowners. "This isn't over yet," I said. "Richard is going to fight back. He won't go down without a final move." Mrs. Jenkins, arms crossed, nodded. "He's been in control for too long. But we won't be bullied anymore." Mr. Patel scanned the crowd. "So, what's next? How do we officially remove him?" That's when Samantha, who had been watching from the back of the room, stepped forward. "We already have enough votes to challenge the board," she said. "And given the financial inconsistencies James has uncovered, the county has reason to conduct an official investigation. But we need to make it public." That gave me an idea. Jenna, the local journalist who had been taking notes the entire meeting, lowered her notepad and smiled knowingly. "You want this on record, don't you?" I nodded. "If we put this in the news, Richard won't just lose his position, he'll lose his reputation." Jenna grinned. "Oh, this is going to be fun." That night, I barely slept. I knew Richard was going to retaliate. The man was a control freak, and losing was not something he could accept easily. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to a nightmare. A bright orange notice was taped to my front door. Effective immediately. Your property is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. If unpaid fines exceed $1,500, a lien will be placed on your home. I laughed. I actually laughed. The pure audacity of this man. But before I could call Samantha, my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. "You should stop now, James. It's not worth it. Threats." He was actually threatening me. Samantha called before I could even process it. "Check the county records," she said immediately. I pulled up the public database on my laptop. Within minutes, my stomach dropped. Richard had filed a claim against my property. He was trying to fast-track a foreclosure notice. I felt my blood boil. "Oh, Richard," I muttered, shaking my head. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." It was time to end this. I called Jenna. "How fast can you get a story out?" I asked. "James," she said, excitement in her voice. "We're already ahead of you." 2 hours later, the headline went live. Local HOA, president faces allegations of misusing funds and targeting homeowners. Social media exploded. Homeowners from other neighborhoods started sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. And the best part? The mayor's office saw it. By the end of the day, the county officially announced an audit into Pinecrest Gardens HOA. Richard was done. That evening, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to see Diane. She looked exhausted. "He's gone," she whispered. "Richard resigned this afternoon." I took a slow breath. "And Karen?" "She's stepping down too." I nodded, crossing my arms. "And you?" Diane sighed. "I made mistakes. I let Richard control too much, but I want to make things right." I studied her for a moment. "Then start by refunding the homeowners who were unfairly fined." She swallowed, then nodded. "Consider it done." Just like that, the fight was over. 1 week later, Pinecrest Gardens had a brand new HOA board. Mr. Patel was the new president. Mrs. Jenkins took over finances. And for the first time in years, the homeowners actually had a say in how things were run. As for Richard, he disappeared. Rumor had it he moved to another neighborhood. But if he thought he could pull this again, he was mistaken. Because now, people knew his name. And me? I finally enjoyed my home. No more bogus violations. No more HOA harassment. Just a quiet, peaceful house. Exactly what I had fought for. And the best part? I won. Richard was gone, but the damage he had done to the neighborhood wouldn't disappear overnight. The HOA board was in shambles, scrambling to cover up the mess he left behind. Diane, now stripped of her authority, kept a low profile, avoiding the neighbors she had once terrorized. Karen had all but vanished. But the homeowners? They were just getting started. The morning after Richard's resignation, I walked out onto my porch to find Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Jenkins waiting for me, steaming mugs of coffee in hand. We had a meeting last night, Mrs. Jenkins said. An actual meeting, Mrs. Patel added, smirking, where people got to speak without being talked over. I leaned against the porch railing. And? Mrs. Jenkins took a slow sip of her coffee before answering. We're voting to dissolve Pinecrest Gardens HOA. I blinked. Wait, you're serious? Mrs. Patel nodded. This neighborhood functioned just fine before the HOA existed. We can manage things ourselves. Set up a simple community council. Just volunteers. No power-hungry board members looking to turn a profit. No excessive fines. No invasive rules. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel throughout this whole fight. Relief. 2 weeks later, the final vote was cast. The HOA was officially dismantled. The ridiculous rules were gone, the fines were erased. And, for the first time in years, people actually started enjoying their homes. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now helped one another with yard work, organized community events, and looked out for each other. Not because they were being forced to, but because they actually cared. And me? I finally got to experience what it was like to just live in my own house. No bogus violations, no fines, no fear of walking outside to find another petty notice taped to my door. Just a quiet, peaceful home. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Jenna pulled up in her car. She had a knowing smile on her face. "You're not going to believe this," she said, handing me a folder. Inside were printed pages, news reports, legal filings, and a final document that made me laugh out loud. Richard had moved to a new neighborhood. And guess what? He was already on the HOA board. I shook my head, tossing the folder onto the table. Some people never learn. Jenna raised an eyebrow. You thinking of getting involved? I took a sip of my drink, watching as neighbors gathered in the distance, chatting, laughing, living. Nah, I said, stretching out in my chair. Let them handle it. I've done my part. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had won. And I had no intention of fighting another battle. I finally had my home back. And that was enough.